There is a strange irony about power. Those who hold it can shape the future. Those who survive it can rewrite the past. Cleopatra VII knew both sides of this truth better than almost any figure in history. She ruled a land where gods were flesh, stars guided destiny, and knowledge itself was a form of empire. Yet today, many people picture her through a lens manufactured thousands of years ago by the very forces that destroyed her. Rome won the war. Rome wrote the biography. Imagine a queen whose story we mostly know through the pens of those who feared and despised her. Not because she lacked brilliance, quite the opposite, but because she had far too much of it. A woman fluent in languages that Roman elites struggled to pronounce. A ruler who understood economics, science, and diplomacy with a precision that threatened the foundations of rising Rome. A strategist shaping Egypt into a global power, while Octavian calculated how to take it from her. So, here is the real question that pulls us into this journey. Who exactly was Cleopatra when we strip away the jealousy, the smear campaigns, the propaganda, and the Hollywood romance? To answer that, we must return to her origin, not as a seductress, but as a scholar and a ruler formed in one of the greatest intellectual capitals humanity has ever known. Alexandria was not merely a city. It was a dream carved into stone and marble, floating on the edge of the Mediterranean like a beacon for every curious mind. Philosophers debated mathematics under colonnades. Engineers studied hydraulics to control the Nile. Astronomers charted the heavens from observatories by the coastline. There, the Great Library collected 500,000 manuscripts, not just scrolls, but the world's memories. This is where Cleopatra was born. Her birth in 69 BCE wasn't just an event, it was a convergence of cultures. Macedonian Greek ancestry tied her bloodline to Alexander the Great. Egyptian religion shaped her political side, identity as a living embodiment of the goddess Isis. Roman ambition, lurking from the west, became the shadow constantly stretching toward her throne. Even the languages she learned up to 8 were not simply skills but doorways into minds, traditions, and political alliances. Unlike most rulers who used interpreters to speak with their own subjects, Cleopatra learned the Egyptian tongue herself. That alone made her revolutionary. Even now, as historians compare fragments of ancient papyri, temple inscriptions, and coins bearing her signature profile, we find a woman fully aware of what image meant. Power was not only on battlefields, it was in symbolism, ritual, titles. When Cleopatra placed the sun disk of Isis atop her crown, she wasn't accessorizing. She was projecting a message. Egypt's history and future were alive in her veins. Cleopatra grew up as royalty, yes, in a palace filled with gold and mosaics, lush gardens and reflecting pools. But she also grew up in a political house where cousins were rivals and siblings were potential assassins. The Ptolemaic dynasty, her dynasty, had survived 3 centuries by practicing loyalty as a temporary negotiation. Marriages were tactical, murders were transitions. Children learned early that trust was a luxury, and so Cleopatra trained herself in the most important survival skill, thinking faster than everyone else. Her tutors introduced her to advanced mathematics used for taxation. She studied astronomy to determine agricultural cycles and establish religious festivals. She trained in rhetoric, how to hold a room with tone, gesture, and silence. Every lesson had a purpose. Never let opponents define your story. Even today, scholars reviewing her policies recognize her strategic ability to balance cultures, manage resources, and communicate with multiple factions. She didn't inherit a peaceful kingdom, she inherited a land drained by politics, corruption, and Roman interference. And yet, she still envisioned a prosperous Egypt that could compete with any empire. To understand Cleopatra's genius is to recognize that she existed at the crossroads of 3 worlds. Egypt, ancient, divine, built on ceremony and continuity. Greece, intellectual, philosophical, foundation of her family legacy. Rome, ruthless, expanding, hungry to control grain and global commerce. She understood them not as concepts, but as networks, each with desires, fears, and power structures. As modern historians argue, this made her less like a queen from an ancient era and more like a 21st century global negotiator. Her enemies mocked her intellect because they could not control it. They mocked her beauty because they feared her presence. They mocked her gender because patriarchy has always been threatened by powerful women who refuse to apologize for their strength. Everything about her story, her education, her leadership, her alliances, reveals a ruler who didn't rely on charm to manipulate men, but who used knowledge to protect a nation. And yet the world remembers love stories instead of policies. Why? Because Rome needed a narrative. Powerful women are threats. Romantic figures are harmless. Tonight, we begin walking through the real Cleopatra's life, from the palaces of Alexandria to the warships at Actium, through scrolls that survived flames and histories rewritten by conquerors. If this queen's story is going to be told, it will be told fully, not in whispers left behind by her enemies. We will continue now, stepping into the heart of Alexandria to meet the world that shaped the genius Rome tried to erase. Alexandria, where knowledge ruled the world. Picture the coast of Egypt shimmering under the Mediterranean sun. A towering structure rises above the waves, the lighthouse of Alexandria. At nearly 400 feet tall, it guided ships safely into the harbor and announced to the world, "Wisdom lives here." Alexandria wasn't simply a day city. It was a promise humanity made to itself that ideas matter, that knowledge should be gathered and protected, and that culture thrives when people from every corner of the world meet and learn together. Cleopatra's world began here. From birth, she was surrounded by scholars who studied geometry with the precision needed to measure pyramids and engineer floodgates. Astronomers charted planets not as gods, but as predictable celestial bodies. Physicians studied anatomy to heal more effectively. Philosophers debated in open courtyards whether the mind controlled the body or the other way around. This intellectual environment wasn't a luxury, it was a political force. Alexandria's knowledge shaped trade, agriculture, religion, and diplomacy. And Cleopatra, unlike many rulers anywhere in the world at the time, did not sit apart from that intellectual machine. She engaged with it. She understood the mechanics of state revenue. She understood how irrigation improvements could stabilize food supply and influence Roman relations. She understood star cycles tied to Egyptian religious calendars. Knowledge wasn't a decoration, it was her power. Her ancestors had come from Greece, but Cleopatra walked into temples wearing Egyptian regalia. Earlier, Ptolemies treated Egypt like land to rule. Cleopatra treated Egypt like a homeland to serve. That shift alone made her beloved by many native Egyptians and resented by Greek elites who preferred to maintain distance. Her commitment to Egyptian identity was political brilliance. By speaking the local language, honoring local gods, and participating in rituals of Isis, she gained trust in a multicultural society where Greek nobility, Egyptian priesthoods, and foreign traders constantly balanced interests. Later, Roman historians framed these religious roles as manipulation, but modern scholars now recognize them as strategic unity building. Now, imagine walking inside the great library's halls, shelves of papyrus scrolls, categorized by librarians whose job was not only to collect knowledge but preserve it. There were translation programs to ensure Egypt understood the world and the world understood Egypt. It wasn't strange for a Greek mathematical treatise to sit next to Egyptian medical scrolls and Babylonian star charts. It was normal and revolutionary. Cleopatra supported this system. Scholars say she sponsored research in navigation, likely boosting Egypt's maritime commerce. There is evidence she provided funding for studies in medicine and pharmacology, possibly driven by her interest in healing and poisons knowledge that would later shape rumors around her death. Her governance was intellectual. She didn't rule from instinct, but analysis. Yet beneath Alexandria's brilliance, politics simmered like the wind beneath desert sands. Egypt may have been wealthy, but it stood in the way of Rome's ambitions. Grain from the Nile fed Roman citizens. Egyptian trade supported Roman merchants. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled the stomach of the empire. And Romans knew the truth. The smartest adversary is the most dangerous one. That was Cleopatra. The world remembers pyramids, golden masks, and mummies. But Cleopatra's story reminds us that the true treasure of Egypt was knowledge. Knowledge Rome wanted to own. So, while Cleopatra spent her youth mastering languages, diplomacy, and the complex identity of her kingdom, an unstoppable force began moving toward Egypt from across the sea, Rome. If Alexandria was a dream, then Roman ambition was the sword ready to slice it in half. Cleopatra was prepared, but she would soon discover that intelligence alone cannot silence those who fear it. Educating a pharaoh, a mind built for power. If Cleopatra's city was a university, her palace was the most advanced classroom in the world. She didn't study as a formality. Every subject had weight. Every lesson was preparation for survival. Her tutors trained her in mathematics, not abstract numbers, but market prices, tax structures, and logistical planning. Egypt was a wealthy land, yet wealth meant nothing if grain didn't move from farms to harbors smoothly. A mistake in numbers could mean famine. Cleopatra learned to prevent it. She studied astronomy not as mysticism, but as practical science. Egyptians used star calendars to predict the Nile flood, which determined agricultural schedules and taxation seasons. The heavens controlled survival on Earth. Cleopatra learned to read them. She studied medicine, likely learning from Egyptian healers whose techniques influenced Greek practices. These studies later fed historical speculation that she knew the most advanced poisons of her era. She trained in rhetoric, how to use voice, posture, and language to influence those in power. Ancient writers described her tone as enchanting not because of melodrama, but because she spoke with intelligence and clarity. Most importantly, she learned languages, perhaps as many as 8. Greek and Egyptian were expected, but Latin, Aramaic, Parthian dialects, and more enabled her to communicate directly with powerful groups, traders, and foreign dignitaries. When a ruler removes interpreters, two things happen. Misunderstandings decrease, and manipulation becomes harder. She understood symbolism, wearing certain crowns or animals like the Uraeus cobra, seen curling above her forehead in art, which represented divine authority and readiness to strike against enemies. Each part of her attire spoke politically. She also studied Egypt's history, a legacy of female pharaohs like Hatshepsut and powerful queens like Tiye, who shaped dynastic politics. She belonged to a cultural tradition that wasn't afraid of women in power. Cleopatra didn't grow into a leader accidentally. She was trained like a weapon, yet knowledge can be both armor and curse. Because she was extraordinary, she was also a threat. Within her own palace, advisors and relatives watched for weakness, plotting for advantage. The Ptolemies rarely trusted each other. Cleopatra grew up knowing affection might turn into betrayal overnight. By the time she was old enough to rule, she was already fluent in fearlessness. At 17, she became queen beside her brother Ptolemy XIII. But the title didn't mean influence. Power was always contested, especially by those who underestimated a young woman. Her brother's advisors began turning him against her, convincing him that Egypt should be ruled by a king, not a queen, with a mind sharp enough to cut through their schemes. The struggle forced Cleopatra from the palace she should have ruled. She found herself exiled from Alexandria, a city whose heartbeat she felt in her bones. But this was not a defeat, it was a transformation. Most rulers raised in luxury would panic or accept fate. Cleopatra raised an army. She understood that a crown is not offered, it is taken with the right alliances. She began communicating with Roman leaders, calculating who could return her to power. She chose Pompey, believing his influence could stabilize Egypt. But Roman politics were shifting by the hour. Pompey, once a mighty general, now fled from his rival Julius Caesar straight into the hands of Egyptians, eager to display loyalty to the winning side. When Pompey was murdered, Cleopatra didn't celebrate her rival's demise. She recognized the moment. Rome's most powerful man would soon arrive in Alexandria, furious about his enemy's dishonorable death. And Cleopatra intended to meet him not as a refugee but as queen. Her famous entrance, hidden in a sack smuggled into Caesar's quarters, reveals her core belief: strategy sometimes requires spectacle. She used surprise as a form of intelligence. Caesar didn't find a helpless exile. He found a ruler who had already solved the equation Roman politics had presented. Their alliance would rewrite the trajectory of Egypt's history. Cleopatra was ready to reclaim what was hers. But as she prepared to face Caesar, another shift occurred. Her story began merging with Rome's fate. And once a queen's name becomes entangled with that of a rising empire, history itself begins sharpening its knives. Because intelligence, especially when held by a woman in power, has always frightened those who desire control. Blood on the throne. Cleopatra understood that every royal banquet in Alexandria carried the weight of a future assassination. Power inside the Ptolemaic dynasty was a fragile agreement held together by wealth, fear, and the illusion that family meant loyalty. Her childhood was filled with whispered warnings: trust no one, smile with caution, and your lineage does not guarantee your safety. The royal crown was beautiful, yes, but it was forged from blades pointed inward. Her father, Ptolemy XII, fought desperately to keep the throne. His rival factions constantly tried to remove him, and Rome exploited every weakness. Cleopatra saw how foreign debt and political compromises hollowed a kingdom from the inside. She watched advisors speak one language in public and another in secret. She saw how bribes traveled faster than decisions. All of it shaped her political maturity. And when Cleopatra's turn came, she entered the chaos with alert eyes. At 17, she inherited the throne beside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was only 13 and easily manipulated by ambitious court ministers Pothinus, Theodotus, and Achilles. They disliked Cleopatra for exactly the qualities that made her remarkable: her intelligence, independence, and ability to communicate with ordinary Egyptians as well as elites. They feared that if she truly ruled, their influence would shrink, so they devised a plan to push her aside. Cleopatra's refusal to remain a ceremonial figure triggered their first attempt at erasing her. They questioned her decisions, blocked her decrees, isolated her politically, and soon the whispers grew into accusations. She was disloyal, she was plotting, she was too close to Rome. We must pause here to understand the Roman dimension. Rome wasn't just a neighbor, it was the superpower waiting to devour Egypt the moment a ruler stumbled. Control of Egypt meant control of grain, feeding the empire's people and army. Egypt's wealth was irresistible. Cleopatra's every move was judged in the shadow of that hunger. So when the political tide in Rome shifted against Pompey, the great Cleopatra's strongest ally, her brother's faction, seized the opportunity. They said she chose the wrong Roman, she must be removed. One night, Cleopatra disappeared from Alexandria, not to escape permanently but to prepare for retaliation. She traveled to Syria, gathered an army, and began planning a return. Most rulers in exile begged for protection. Cleopatra created a pathway back to the throne. This period shows us the core of her power. She didn't rely on others to save her. She relied on strategy. While Cleopatra sharpened her plans, Alexandria's court celebrated too soon. They expected her to crumble away in foreign lands, forgetting that survival was her first language. But war followed them faster than they could imagine. At that exact time, Pompey fled to Egypt, defeated by Julius Caesar in Greece. Pompey believed he would find safety here because he once supported Cleopatra's father. Instead, the advisors convinced Ptolemy XIII that assassinating Pompey would impress Caesar and secure alliance with the new Roman victor. So, Pompey, the former master of Rome's armies, stepped onto the shores of Egypt expecting refuge. He received a sword instead. His severed head was delivered like a prize. To the advisors, this was clever politics. To Caesar, it was an unforgivable insult. Rome respected grandeur in victory, not cowardice dressed as strategy. Caesar approached, Alexandria furious, ready to restore honor. That fury became Cleopatra's opportunity. Her brother was preparing for war. Cleopatra was preparing for history. She knew she could not enter the palace openly. Guards would seize her immediately. So she devised her most famous theatrical maneuver. Hidden inside a sack of bedding, smuggled past guards by her loyal ally Apollodorus, she appeared in Caesar's private chambers, a queen arriving like a secret. That moment tells us something powerful about Cleopatra's mindset. She understood that the right entrance can change an entire outcome. Caesar saw not a defeated exile, but a brilliant political force. He recognized ambition equal to his own, and in that recognition, Cleopatra reclaimed her throne. Ptolemy XIII, angered by Caesar's decision to support her, declared war. Alexandria descended into violence, fire scorching the edges of the great library and turning parts of the harbor into battlegrounds. Cleopatra didn't run. She aligned her forces with Caesar's legions, and together they fought through streets, temples, and royal docks. When reinforcements finally arrived for Caesar, Ptolemy's forces collapsed. The young king drowned in the Nile while retreating. Cleopatra emerged victorious but not unscarred. War had destroyed parts of her kingdom. Roman influence was now firmly embedded. And while she had regained power, she knew the future was tied to Caesar's favor. Her son, Caesarion, born soon after, symbolized that connection and became a direct threat to Rome's stability. Cleopatra had survived one enemy, but a new one waited patiently across the Mediterranean. If Rome feared her intelligence before, now it feared her lineage. A child who merged Egyptian divinity with Roman imperial blood, that was too powerful a symbol. Tonight's story moves forward from battle-torn Alexandria to the heart of Rome, where admiration is dangerous and love is political. The carpet, the general, and the siege of Alexandria. Caesar and Cleopatra walked through the palace floors, still stained with conflict. They needed each other, but their alliance was far more than romance, despite how Roman propaganda later twisted it. To Caesar, Cleopatra represented stability in Egypt, wealth, food, and naval access to the Mediterranean. To Cleopatra, Caesar represented protection against future coups and the legitimacy needed to rebuild her kingdom without constant civil war. People often tell this story as if Cleopatra bewitched Caesar. That framing reveals more about fear of powerful women than the truth. Cleopatra impressed him not with flirtation, but with fluency in politics, economics, and cultural complexity. Inside that palace, their negotiations shaped global history. But outside those walls, chaos persisted. Supporters of Ptolemy XIII refused surrender. The royal forces surrounded Caesar and Cleopatra, sparking the infamous siege of Alexandria. This wasn't a small revolt. It was a citywide confrontation that tested Cleopatra's resilience and Caesar's survival instincts. Buildings near the Great Library caught fire during the struggle. Historians debate whether the fire destroyed scrolls or nearby warehouses, but either way, Alexandria saw knowledge burn. For Cleopatra, that loss wasn't just architectural damage, it was an attack on the intellectual lifeblood of her kingdom. Yet she didn't falter. She worked with Caesar, using her intimate understanding of Alexandria's geography, its canals, hidden passages, and choke points to counter enemy movements. While Caesar led the legions, Cleopatra led the city. When reinforcements from Rome finally arrived, the balance broke. Ptolemy XIII tried to flee but drowned in the Nile, armor dragging him under. His body was pulled from the water as a reminder. Destiny favors the bold. Victory restored Cleopatra, but the aftermath reshaped her entirely. She was no longer simply a side queen. She was a geopolitical force. Egypt now carried Rome's attentions. Caesar's presence guaranteed order, but also reminded everyone that Rome's reach now extended through Cleopatra's decisions. The marriage between Egypt and Roman ambition was sealed not by ceremony, but by war. Shortly later, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy Xv, called Caesarion. His name alone carried political weight. Some Romans feared he could one day claim Caesar's throne with Egyptian support. A child symbolizing unity was interpreted instead as threat. Caesar didn't publicly acknowledge the boy as his heir. Roman tradition demanded that claim pass through adoption of a citizen. Yet, Cleopatra knew the truth. She had created a link between two empires, and links can become chains or bridges depending on who controls them. With the war concluded, Caesar decided to bring Cleopatra to Rome not as a guest, but as a partner in political vision. Imagine the scene: Cleopatra's royal barge traveling up the Tiber River, priests of Isis carrying symbols of Egyptian divinity behind her, a queen entering Rome with a child who might redefine everything. Rome watched, and Rome whispered. To the Roman elite, Cleopatra was a terrifying possibility, a woman of power, wealth, and education, appearing at the side of their most influential leader. The Senate murmured insults behind gilded columns, calling her foreign, dangerous, cunning, anything to belittle the brilliance they couldn't control. Caesar built a golden statue of Cleopatra in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, linking her to divine ancestry. Romans felt the weight of that symbol. A goddess queen within arm's reach of political authority threatened their republican pride. Cleopatra stayed in Caesar's villa outside the city center, a tactical choice to avoid inflaming resentment further. But resentment doesn't listen to caution. Rome buzzed with rumors, satirists mocked her, families worried she would replace Roman noblewomen as the standard of power. She demonstrated that authority didn't need Roman approval, and that terrified those who had built their identity on superiority. Still, Cleopatra didn't hide. She attended gatherings with elegance and confidence. She showed the Romans that her presence wasn't a disruption. It was a reminder that the Mediterranean world wasn't Rome alone. Through it all, she observed, studied, calculated. Her mind never slept. She watched senators watch her. She measured alliances through glances and whispers. Even as tensions grew, she held her head high, because Cleopatra wasn't there for applause. She was there for Egypt. Then everything changed in a single violent moment. Caesar collapsed beneath knives in the Senate. Betrayed by men who feared his rise, Romans erupted into chaos. The queen, who once seemed like a bridge, now found herself on the wrong side of a collapsing empire. And Cleopatra understood instantly: Rome without Caesar was no place for Caesar's ally. With her child, she sailed back to Egypt carrying both grief and determination. She had lost her greatest partner, but not her purpose. The game would continue. Rome was entering a new storm, and Cleopatra was ready to navigate it. Queen in Rome. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria with a sharper view of Rome. She had looked into the eyes of the Senate and seen both admiration and fear. Rome could offer alliances, but never security. She realized that Egypt must strengthen itself not as Rome's satellite, but as its most valuable partner or its most elusive rival. Grieving privately for Caesar, she stepped into public life stronger than ever. She ruled with renewed focus. Taxation reforms, agricultural oversight, military modernization, and expansion of Egypt's scientific institutions. The city awakened once again, its harbors busy with trade ships, its academies buzzing with research. But Rome was not finished shaping her fate. Two power figures emerged after Caesar's assassination: Mark Antony and Octavian. Antony controlled the east, Octavian controlled the west. Though allies for the moment, their rivalry was as predictable as the Nile flood. It was simply waiting to happen. Mark Antony remembered Cleopatra well, not just as a queen, but as a strategic equal. He admired her ability to project strength wrapped in diplomacy. When he summoned her to Tarsus, she recognized the moment instantly. The future of the Mediterranean hung between them like a negotiation waiting to be spoken aloud. So she arrived, not quietly but like a queen who understood symbolism better than any ruler alive. Purple sails, silver oars, incense drifting across the water, a theatrical reminder that Egypt was still the most fascinating kingdom in existence. This wasn't seduction, it was diplomacy. Cleopatra needed Rome. Rome needed Egypt. Antony saw in her not a liability, but a visionary partner. Together, they imagined a world where Greek-Egyptian governance counterbalanced Roman aggression. Their union symbolized a future the Senate did not want, a world where power wasn't dictated by Rome alone. But alliances become battles the moment Rome feels threatened. Octavian watched Antony drift toward Cleopatra, and he sharpened his greatest weapon, propaganda. He painted Cleopatra as a witch, a foreign queen corrupting a Roman hero, a threat not only to politics, but to Roman identity itself. He spread lies disguised as patriotism. Suddenly, Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was the villain of Rome's new story. Inside Alexandria, however, life thrived. Cleopatra expanded the fleet. She developed trade with India and Africa. She empowered Egyptian religion and local pride. She raised her 3 children with Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, names carrying cosmic symbolism. Their future was imagined as rulers of a new dynasty, stretching across continents. A world led by knowledge instead of cruelty. That dream alone was enough to provoke Rome to war. Antony loved Cleopatra, yes, but more importantly, he believed in her vision, a Mediterranean where empires shared power instead of stealing it. Octavian called that treason, so the world braced for conflict. The final struggle wasn't just between armies, it was between 2 entirely different understandings of leadership. Rome said power must be controlled by men and written by victors. Cleopatra represented a future where leadership could be multilingual, multicultural, and guided by scholarship as much as steel. This wasn't a love story, it was a fight for the story itself. History, as you will soon hear, was about to be rewritten by the winner. The sun and the moon. Cleopatra understood something that most rulers across history have ignored. Power does not only live on scrolls or battlefields. Sometimes, the strongest power lives in the connection between 2 people, a connection that can reshape empires. That is what happened when Cleopatra and Mark Antony stood face to face in Tarsus. He was Rome's most esteemed general, seasoned by years of war, laughter, and exhaustion. She was Egypt's queen, brilliant, composed, and devastatingly aware of how symbols can command an audience before a single word is spoken. Antony watched her arrive on a ship that looked less like a vessel and more like a floating prophecy. Purple sails, royal exclusivity, golden stern wealth beyond Rome's control. Perfume in the air, reminding everyone that influence can be breathed in. Cleopatra stepped onto the deck with the slow assurance of someone who had already predicted the outcome. Antony smiled, not the polite smile of diplomacy, but the surprise smile of a man meeting someone who finally matched his scale. What happened next has been dramatized for centuries, often reduced to romance. But history is more interesting than that. Antony and Cleopatra shared a common enemy, vulnerability. He needed financial stability to maintain power in the East. She needed military backing to protect Egypt from future Roman interference. Yet the alliance worked only because they understood each other emotionally. They were, in the simplest form, human beings hungry for someone who could see past the armor. That shared recognition became the seed of something stronger than any political calculation. Over time, laughter filled their meetings. Strategy flowed seamlessly into affection. Cleopatra's wit challenged Antony's confidence, and he liked that challenge. She admired that he was not threatened by her intellect, a rarity in her world. Together, they began imagining a world they could build, Egypt and Rome as partners, not predator and prey. Their children carried names that reached toward the cosmos: Helios, the sun, and Selene, the moon. This was not poetic excess. To Egyptians, celestial identity was divine legitimacy. To Greeks, it implied philosophical harmony. To Rome, it suggested a future where they might not be the center of everything. Emotion and ambition intertwined. But passion, when it influences power, also threatens those who fear losing control. Octavian watched from afar, quietly collecting every moment, every banquet, every rumor, every symbol, and sharpening them into weapons. He said Cleopatra was not a queen, but a temptress bent on destroying Rome. He claimed Antony had abandoned Roman virtues for Eastern luxury. The Senate, anxious, aging, and prejudiced, believed him, because fear loves an easy enemy. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony lived fully banquets, filled with music, political ideas discussed under starlight, children learning both Egyptian myth and Roman strategy. Their palace became a place where decisions were made not just by swords, but by scholars. Yet even within that golden bubble, both could feel the distant rumble of a coming storm. Antony drank to silence it. Cleopatra focused on strengthening fleets and economies. They were in love, they were in danger, and neither emotion could be separated from the other. The world was shifting. The sun and the moon had aligned, but Rome believed the sky belonged to them. The city that believed in her. There is something extraordinary about a leader who does not rule from fear or hierarchy but from empowerment. Cleopatra worked every day to prove that intelligence, not lineage alone, made her worthy of the throne. Under her guidance, Alexandria reached a vibrancy that rivaled its founding age. Travelers described the city as alive music from theaters, merchants calling out new spices, mathematicians solving problems in public porticos, astronomers adjusting metal instruments to follow planets across the night sky. The harbor gleamed with arriving ships from Africa, Arabia, India, and beyond. Egypt was the Mediterranean's beating economic heart, and the queen was the mind ensuring its pulse never faltered. Cleopatra improved irrigation systems to protect crops against unpredictable Nile flows. She supported industrial expansions, glasswork, papyrus production, textiles, and perfumes became valuable exports. She reduced corruption by enforcing stricter accountability among officials. When taxation threatened the livelihood of farmers, she adjusted policies to prevent rebellion, prioritizing stability over greed. She didn't only rule from the throne, she visited workshops, she asked questions. She listened. At the Great Library, scholars pushed the boundaries of medicine, engineering, cartography, and linguistics. Cleopatra invested in their work because she believed knowledge was not simply intellectual luxury, it was national security. A smarter Egypt would never bow easily to imperial rule. This vision extended into architecture, temples and palaces aligned with cosmic markers, blending sacred geometry with political symbolism. In religion, she strengthened Egyptian identity by embracing her role as Isis on earth, not in arrogance, but to unify a diverse population under a shared spiritual belonging. Children in Alexandria grew up seeing a woman lead confidently. For many, this became normal. Cleopatra was rewriting social imagination, showing that leadership was a matter of skill, not gender. Meanwhile, her relationship with Antony brought Egypt unprecedented political leverage. Together, they distributed eastern territories among their children, a symbolic blueprint for the future. Rome saw a threat. Alexandria saw possibility. Yet success has a way of placing a target on your back. As their prosperity grew, so did Roman resentment. Octavian needed a reason to eliminate Antony, and Cleopatra offered a perfect storyline. He didn't need evidence, he only needed a narrative. Rumors intensified. Antony is a puppet. Cleopatra designs to rule Rome. She lures men into destruction. It was propaganda rooted in fear that Rome might lose its dominance, fear that a woman could wield equal power, fear that culture itself might shift. Antony's letters expressing loyalty to Cleopatra were reinterpreted as betrayal of Rome. Cleopatra's wealth was described as corruption, not accomplishment. The Senate, guided by Octavian's careful manipulation, declared war technically not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. Rome wanted the world to believe that Egypt was the enemy, not internal Roman ambition. For Cleopatra, the line was now drawn clearly. She wasn't simply protecting Egypt anymore. She was protecting an idea that empires could work together instead of cannibalizing each other. That dream demanded a fight, but in war, even the brightest city casts dark shadows. Anxiety crept into Alexandria. Ships were prepared. Last rituals of blessing were whispered in temples. Soldiers sharpened weapons beneath the lighthouse beams. Mothers prayed over sons. Cleopatra remained composed. She reassured her people with presents, not slogans. Antony stood beside her as both protector and beloved. Their hands, clasped in private moments, told the truth. They feared losing each other more than losing power. And as the war approached, they realized the most painful truth of all: Rome wasn't attacking them because they were weak. Rome was attacking because they were strong. The sea turns against them. The year was 31 BCE. The future of the Mediterranean world crashed toward a single point on the coast of Greece, Actium. There, the sea didn't just reflect sunlight. It reflected the ambitions of men, the courage of a queen, and the fragility of dreams built in the space between empires. On one side, Octavian's forces, commanded by his trusted admiral Agrippa, disciplined, calculating, and funded by a Rome now convinced that war was salvation. On the other, Antony and Cleopatra, an alliance of passion and purpose, backed by Egypt's incredible fleet and resources. The battle began as winds picked up across the waters. Cleopatra sat at the heart of her navy, aboard a ship with a sacred golden prow. Her presence was not pageantry. It was belief, a leader showing she was willing to face the same storm as her people. But battles are never determined solely by courage. Octavian's strategy focused on patience, cutting off supply routes and forcing Antony's fleet into desperation. Disease and hunger wore down morale. The longer they waited, the more victory leaned toward Rome. Yet Antony refused to surrender, not to Octavian, not to public fear. Cleopatra stayed by his side, refusing to flee to safety or hide behind palace walls. Her strength was visible, not hidden. Soldiers felt pride knowing their queen chose to risk everything alongside them. As ships clashed, shields shattered, and arrows traced the sky, the noise of war drowned out the music that once filled Alexandria. Timber split, and waves swallowed men with brutal indifference. But here's where myth and politics collide. Roman writers later claimed that Cleopatra fled early cowardice, they said. Emotion overpowering reason. A queen thinking only of herself, that's the version history books inherited from conquerors. Modern analysis paints a far more strategic picture. Cleopatra's command to retreat was likely tactical, protecting the remaining fleet when the battle seemed unwinnable. Some historians argue she was preserving the core of Egyptian strength, saving the future when the present was slipping away. Antony followed her, torn between loyalty and desperation. They withdrew to Alexandria not in victory, but not in surrender either. But Rome didn't care for nuance. Octavian used Actium to portray Antony as a man broken by love, not war. He distributed coins showing crocodiles symbolizing Egypt chained beneath Roman dominance. He gave speeches declaring that Cleopatra had bewitched Antony, reducing a decorated general to emotional ruin. It worked because Roman fear needed an explanation. How could one queen, one foreign woman, stand so close to altering world history? So they rewrote the story. Cleopatra wasn't powerful, she was manipulative. Antony wasn't loyal, he was blinded by passion. Rome didn't fear them. Rome saved itself from them. Propaganda did the rest. In Alexandria, Cleopatra held her children closer, praying that her people wouldn't lose faith. Antony, plagued with guilt, began to fracture internally. He saw the future slipping beyond reach and could no longer separate public defeat from personal heartbreak. But Cleopatra remained steady in his darkest moments. She urged strategy, she counted resources. She sent diplomats, she fortified Alexandria like a queen who still saw paths forward. Love and leadership coexisted in her, neither diminishing the other. As the Roman army approached the Nile Delta, the queen stood overlooking the sea that once promised hope. Her mind raced through possibilities. Surrender, not on her terms. Escape, not without Antony. Death, not without deciding its meaning. The alliance that once imagined the world reshaped now faced the hardest truth. Empires attack most fiercely when their supremacy is questioned. Cleopatra and Antony hadn't failed because they were weak. They were attacked because they were daring, and Rome would rather destroy something beautiful than admit it was afraid. The last queen standing. The streets of Alexandria had never been silent. Even in tense moments of history, the city breathed like a living mind, whispers of scholars, the clatter of trade, the rhythm of ships arriving at the harbor. But now, as Octavian's forces approached its walls, silence stretched across the capital like a heavy shroud. Cleopatra stood on the palace balcony, watching the horizon fade behind dust and marching troops. She felt the pulse of her city beneath her feet, her people's fear, her soldiers' fatigue, the quiet resilience that had defined Egypt for thousands of years. Her heart ached for what she saw, a civilization at the edge of foreign hands. Mark Antony entered behind her, his armor removed, his eyes heavy with 1,000 regrets. The bravest man in Rome now felt reduced by narratives he didn't write. Guilt clung to him like metal. He believed he had failed her, failed Egypt, failed himself. Cleopatra turned to him not as a queen to a defeated general, but as a woman who knew this man had fought for her more fiercely than anyone before. They stood in silence, communication flowing without words. Some historians later claimed Antony was her puppet, but that was fear masquerading as scholarship. The truth was simpler. They were partners, equals in vision and determination. Below them, priests prepared protective rituals dedicated to Isis and Serapis, invoking ancient guardians of Egypt. Cleopatra believed in symbols, not superstition, but the power of shared belief to keep identity alive. The crown she wore was more than gold. It represented millennia of rulers who shaped human civilization. She refused to be remembered as the queen who surrendered that legacy. Octavian's envoys approached with terms disguised as mercy. They demanded she abandon Antony and kneel in submission. They promised safety in Rome, but as a spectacle, a trophy dragged through the streets so Octavian could boast of conquering the world's most iconic queen. Cleopatra didn't answer them immediately. She understood that every moment of hesitation bought time to protect her children, time to negotiate her people's safety, time to control her final narrative. Inside her private chambers, she ordered scrolls burned, not knowledge, but sensitive state secrets Rome would exploit. She hid treasures, military logs, letters, and intellectual property that could benefit her enemies. This wasn't desperation. This was a final act of leadership. Antony was torn between rage and sorrow. Holding a sword felt meaningless now. He couldn't duel propaganda with steel. When he heard a false report that Cleopatra had taken her life, despair consumed him. His sword struck his own chest, but survival lingered punishingly slow. His men carried him to Cleopatra as he bled, pale and weakening. She received him in her arms, tears stinging not because their love was ending, but because he would not see the future she still intended to control, even in death. Antony's last words were not defeated, they were a plea. Don't let them take you. He trusted her to do what he could not. She kissed his forehead and whispered that she would not allow Rome the satisfaction of owning their story. Antony died, not as a fallen traitor, but as a man who followed loyalty over power. With his final breath, Cleopatra felt something unlock inside her, not tragedy but clarity. Little time remained. Octavian was too close. Egypt couldn't be saved from annexation, but she could ensure that Egypt's queen would never be captured, paraded, humiliated, or turned into propaganda. Her final strategy was beginning. The death Rome couldn't win. Octavian entered Alexandria with the confidence of a victor. But he wasn't calm. He knew Cleopatra was a strategist to the very end. Her mind was still the battlefield, and he had yet to conquer that terrain. He ordered guards to watch her constantly. He stationed soldiers outside her chambers, fearing that even in ruin she could deny him his greatest political prize, showing her off as the symbol of Egypt's defeat. To Rome, nothing was more powerful than a spectacle. Octavian wanted Cleopatra to stand in chains during his triumphal parade, proof that even goddesses bow before him. Cleopatra understood this perfectly, and that understanding fueled her next move. She requested a final audience with Octavian. He agreed, believing he could persuade her to accept captivity. As she entered the hall, she wore no crown, just a simple yet flawless linen dress. Her presence, even stripped of symbols, remained undeniable. Octavian was unsettled. He saw not a ruined queen, but a woman who still held command over the space around her. She asked for promises, her children's lives. He hesitated, then answered with political vagueness words that protected only his advantage. Cleopatra read between the lines with ease. Her children would be props too. That was the moment she decided. Death would not be Rome's victory, it would be her rebellion. A queen decides how her story ends. After the meeting, Cleopatra returned to her chambers beneath the watchful eyes of guards. Yet she was not alone. Her most loyal attendants, who had followed her through every storm, still waited for orders. She sat among her treasures, symbols of Egypt's genius, papyrus maps of trade routes, jars of North African oils, astrolabes for navigation, and scrolls, documenting astronomical calculations far ahead of Rome's. She touched them one last time. She knew knowledge would outlive empires, even when monuments fall. In her hands, she held a small container gifted by her physician, a man who studied venoms and painless ends. The popular story says a snake slipped beneath her gown, a dramatic image that Rome loved because they believed it made her look irrational. Yet historians and toxicologists today see the truth. Cleopatra planned her final act with precision. Venom can be controlled, pain can be avoided, timing can be mastered. She positioned herself on a couch draped in royal cloth. She requested her attendants to place Antony's letters beside her, binding their bond beyond mortality. She asked that her burial honor him not as Rome's enemy, but as Egypt's ally. When she ingested the poison, she wasn't escaping, she was choosing victory. She ensured Rome would never own her image. She denied Octavian the theater he wanted. She protected her dignity. She protected her identity. She protected Egypt's narrative from being rewritten into mockery. Her attendants cried as the poison slipped through her veins, but Cleopatra remained steady. She exhaled slowly, her eyes holding a calm resolve, the kind only a leader with absolute conviction can possess. Her final expression was not fear, it was sovereignty. When Octavian arrived moments later, it was too late. She lay dressed in royal garments, her face composed like a final speech he could not silence. He stared, rage and awe competing within him. He had conquered Egypt, but he had not conquered Cleopatra. History is rarely kind to the defeated, but Cleopatra ensured she could never be framed as defeated. A queen chooses her horizon. Cleopatra's immortal rebellion. Rome took Egypt. Octavian became Augustus, the first Roman emperor. And for 2,000 years, Roman stories shaped the image of Cleopatra. Seductive, manipulative, emotional. A woman who destroyed men. A queen who lost everything. Yet the evidence that remains contradicts Rome's smear campaign. Coins show a ruler with strong features, intelligence, not vanity. Papyri reveal economic reforms, not decadence. Architectural remnants reveal astronomic alignments, not chaos. The Great Library's surviving influences reveal scientific advancement, not luxury for luxury's sake. Modern Egyptology, feminist historiography, archaeology, psychology, they tell a different truth. Cleopatra didn't lose. Rome feared her so much they tried to erase her genius. If she was merely beautiful, Rome wouldn't have needed propaganda. If she was merely charming, they wouldn't have rewritten her story. If she was merely seductive, she wouldn't have shaken empires. Rome feared Cleopatra because she was a multilingual scholar who understood the power of communication, a military strategist who saved her fleet when war turned, an economic leader who strengthened a story, empire from within, a religious icon who unified a multicultural population, a symbol of female autonomy in a world built by men, a political visionary imagining diplomacy over conquest. She represented everything Rome didn't want the world to become. Yet time is not Rome's ally. Today, scholars restore what poets distorted. Egyptian inscriptions reveal her popularity. North African historians highlight her legacy as resistance. Manuscript studies challenge Roman bias. Anthropology emphasizes the cultural empowerment she fostered. Myth studies show how she lives on as the archetype of the resilient queen. Cleopatra's tomb remains undiscovered, and perhaps that is perfect. If Rome could not display her in chains, they cannot display her in death. She became a legend they cannot control. And when you stand in modern Alexandria, watching the Mediterranean shift under sunlight, you feel that she is not gone. Her story lingers in the air like the scent of lotus oil. Her name appears in languages she once mastered. Her symbols Ankh, cobra, sun disk still carry meaning. Cleopatra never surrendered, she transformed. She lives in every woman who leads with intelligence. She lives in every nation that refuses domination. She lives in every story Rome tried to bury but could not silence. More than any pharaoh before her, Cleopatra proved that power is not defined by survival. Power is defined by how long the world remembers you. Rome crowned themselves conquerors, but Cleopatra crowned herself unforgettable, and that is the rebellion they will never defeat.